started yesterday. I'm already halfway through. It's like a mystery story, and it's great fun to read. I have some books out the back from Bookends, and after the program, Susan Dworkin, the author, will be happy to sign books for you. Susan Dworkin's much-praised book, The Viking in the Wheat Field, is a highly readable exploration of a vital subject which most of us know too little about: the science and the politics that controls our food supply. Soon there will be 9 billion people on this planet, but the acreage available for growing food is already under cultivation. How are we going to feed so many more people? The Viking in the Wheat Field is a biography of a wheat breeder, Beth Skovman, and a user-friendly guide to agricultural politics for non-farmers. Bookends has given us both hardcover and paperback copies for her to sign after her presentation. Susan has published 13 books. Her book, The Nazi Officer's Wife, written with the woman on whose story it is based, Edith Hahn Beer, has become an international bestseller. She's written several plays, including The Old Mezzo, to be performed in Pittsfield, Mass. Next year. All Day Suckers, a hit of the 2010 New York Fringe Festival. The Farm Bill, The Miami Dig, and The Forgotten Lover, which have been produced in New York and regional theaters. Her show, The Book of Candy, with music by Mel Marvin, directed by Avi Spindell, was voted Best New Musical by the New York Star Ledger. She was for 10 years a contributing editor to Ms. Magazine. Her articles have appeared in Cosmopolitan, the New York Times Magazine, Ladies' Home Journal, and the Los Angeles Times, and many other publications. Please welcome Susan Dworkin. Would you like to do the all night, or would you like to hold it? You know, let's try to look up.
All right. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming. I'm here to talk to you about a really difficult subject, which is about the future of the food supply, which most people in our neck of the woods really know nothing about. I mean, we go to the market, we know what it costs to buy a loaf of bread, we know what it costs to buy a gallon of milk, but we don't really think about what's going on with the farmers. And the reason is that in this day and age, very few of us know any farmers. There used to be that half the people in the United States either had a farm or had somebody who had a farm in the family. I mean, my grandmother's brother had a farm in New Jersey, and he had cows, and it was a dairy farm. And I remember as a little kid, we would go out there once or twice, and then it disappeared. And for the rest of my life, we didn't have a farm in the family. And I don't know how many people here have a farm in the family, but it's a distant memory. It's a distant memory. And the reason is that there are fewer and fewer farms, fewer and fewer farmers. It used to be in 1920, the average American farm was 180 acres. By 1950, the average American farm is about 300 acres. And now the average American farm is about 450 acres. And of the general population, 2.6% of people in the general population of the United States are farmers, and of that group, 3% own such huge farms that they produce 75% of the food. 3% of the 2.6%. I mean, it's just astonishing how big farming is in this country, industrial farming. So the reason I started this project of Viking in the Wheat Field was as I'm interested in agriculture. I used to work for the USDA in kind of my mad youth. And I was very impressed with the things that they were doing with agriculture and science, which I will tell you about. And I stayed interested in it even after after I got married and had children and then became a New Yorker and started working for Ms. Magazine, I stayed interested in agriculture and farming and in what was happening to our country's food supply. And when we had, do you remember the presidential debates between John McCain and Barack Obama? There was not one mention of farming, not one mention. Presidential debates, nothing at all about agriculture. And I thought to myself, this is really serious. This is a serious problem. We are helpless eaters, hundreds of millions of people, helpless eaters, and we know nothing about what's going on down on the farm. And so I started working on the Viking wheat field. And I want to tell you a story which will illustrate to you the central conflict in the way food is produced in our country. A farmer, sheep herding farmer, is walking down the road, and he's got a giant herd of sheep with him, and up the road comes a man in a tie and a suit smoking a pipe. And he sees the farmer and the sheep and says to the farmer, the guy with the pipe and the suit, says to the farmer, I betcha I can tell you, just by looking at you, exactly how many sheep you have in that herd. The farmer says, okay, sheep all right. He says, all right, give it a shot. So the guy looks and thinks, and he says, you have 973 sheep. The farmer says, wow, that's amazing. That's just astonishing. How can I pay you for this fabulous service? And he says, you know what, I'll take one of your animals. I'll take one of your animals in payment for my erudition and my brilliance. So he picks up the animals, he starts to walk off. The farmer says, wait a minute. Let me get even. Give me a shot to get even. Let me guess who you are. The guy standing there, he says, okay, give it a shot. The farmer says, you are an economist from the World Bank, and you decide which agricultural programs in this world get funded. That's fantastic. How did you know that? And the farmer says, as soon as you put down my dog, I will tell you. There you go. That's the problem. The problem is that there is this gulf between the politicians and the economists and how they decide to organize the agriculture of the world, how it gets distributed, who pays for it, who gets to sandwich their chemicals onto it and patent it, like Monsanto and BASF, who gets to run this huge economic program, and the farmer, who's raising the sheep, who knows exactly what he needs to do to feed his family and his neighbors. The most important thing that you have to understand about agriculture today is that much of agriculture is not about food. We produce 60 million tons of wheat in this country every year. Imagine that, 60 million tons. 30 million tons are shipped overseas. So we only keep the 30 million tons for ourselves. 30 million tons of wheat. Does that all get bought by Sara Lee? A lot of it gets bought by Sara Lee, actually. They're the biggest. Does it all get bought by Pillsbury? Does it all get made into flour? Does it all get made into bread? No. Some of it gets made into fodder for animals. Right? So instead of letting the cows go across the pasture and graze, we keep the cows in gigantic industrial farming. We keep the cows locked up in their stalls, and we put the grain in front of them, and they eat. They don't move, but they eat. Then eventually we take them to market and they're fatter, and they weigh more, and they're worth more money. So fodder is one thing. The other thing we do with grain is that we make it into drugs. Not just grain. You know how they make estrogen? They make it from yams. They make it from yams. The yam business is terrific ever since they invented the birth control pill. Fabulous. It's gone through the roof, the yam business. How do they make, let's see, how do they make insulin? They used to make it from the pancreas of animals. Now they grow it. What do we do with tobacco? Why do we still produce tobacco? Not because we're smoking. We're smoking much less. We produce tobacco as a kind of drug-bearing plant. We infuse it with certain genes that make it produce certain antibiotics. It's a very useful plant. It's called a nutraceutical. A nutraceutical. Every time you fill up your car with gas, it says 10% ethanol. Ethanol can be made from goat grass, can be made from corn stubble. We generally make it from corn. Why do we make it from corn? Because of a giant economic understanding of how valuable corn is and how much money corn puts into the pockets of farmers and companies like ADM and big industrial farms. So we make ethanol, which is supposed to save our planet from the crop that is the most wasteful way to grow ethanol in terms of water, in terms of power. We could make it from stubble. We could make it from, in Brazil, they run the whole country on ethanol, and it's all made from the stubble left over from sugarcane. And after you get rid of the sugar, if you cut down the sugarcane, there's this sort of garbage left in the field. Perfectly good ethanol, runs the whole country. So that's number one that you have to really understand. How much money is involved for how many different kinds of corporations in producing farming, in production farming. It's not just feeding the people, okay? That's number one. Number two is that we have a very peculiar relationship in our country between the private sector and the public sector in terms of agriculture. There are so few farmers, and yet they are so powerful. The farm lobby is so powerful that they're going to cut public television, they're going to cut funding for women's health, they're going to cut all kinds of things that many of us think are very, very important, but they're not going to cut funding for the subsidies for farmers, because the lobbies that control farming are so very, very powerful, and they lobby ceaselessly. And they control the great Middle West, as well as California, of our country. I mean, there are vast areas and a lot of senators. And so the farm lobbies, the sugar lobby, the cotton lobby, the wheat lobby. You go to the USDA, go to the Department of Agriculture, the lady on the wheat desk at the USDA says, they're right down the block. They're right at the bottom of the hill there. And they're here every morning and every afternoon. And if we don't listen to them, we're in trouble. We can't get our budget passed. So you can't underestimate how many people are making a lot of money out of farming, even though they're not all of them farmers. Right? They're in the drug business, they're in the shipping business, they're in the railroad business, they're in the oil business. Okay? That's just okay. So now how do you farm vast areas and get the most from the fields? How do you get the most yield? Well, one of the most efficient ways to do that is to plant everything the same. If you're planting corn, you only plant one kind of corn, because and it's all the same height. It all is harvested at the same exact day, right? You can then set your tractor to the same height, and all your machinery works for this incredibly uniform crop, right? Awesome. What is the problem with that? The problem with that is that if some little bug decides that it's going to attack that kind of corn, all of it gets sick. So diversity is a tremendous need in farming. You have to have different kinds of crops. And you have to have different kinds of varieties of the same crop. You can't just plant one kind of cotton because the boll weevil will come and destroy all the cotton. You won't have any cotton. So you've got to have alternative cotton, right? This is a necessity that we all understand as human beings, as consumers, but big corporate business doesn't really care too much very often. And so they get into a lot of trouble. The banana, you know, we used to have a kind of banana that was harvested in Central America by United Fruit called the Gros Michel banana. My mother remembers this banana. Apparently it was a very tasty banana. And it sold very well. People enjoyed eating this banana. It was nice, it was pretty. And so they planted gazillions of acres in this banana, and then a terrible disease came and killed all the Gros Michel bananas and nearly wiped out a great corporation and millions of people in Central America. But so the great corporation, what did the great corporation, which was United Fruit, what did they do? They're basically a shipping company. Other people are farming the bananas, they're collecting them and sending them here. What did they do? They let it go. They planted another kind of banana, all the same. Once again, all the same. And Gros Michel bananas became extinct. Literally extinct. They aren't there anymore. Now there's a few plants here and there, you know, in some museum. But that's what happens. The idea of bigness, the idea of hugeness in agriculture is inimical to the idea of diversity. Can you think of a great tragedy in the in the 19th century that was caused by uniformity in agriculture and caused a great migration to this country? The Irish potato famine. Why did the Irish potato famine destroy so many people, killed a million people, left the country in such poverty? Why? Because it was all the same kind of potatoes. It was one kind of potatoes. And since the Brits had locked up the alternative crops like wheat, and there was some certain politics involved that's horrible to imagine, the people were eating potatoes. That was their staple food. And the Irish potato famine was caused by one disease called potato late blight, and it destroyed all the potatoes in Ireland. So diversity, having an alternative, having genes from the same gene pool available to inject into new breeds so that you could resist new bugs, that's a very important thing to do. How do we get diversity? Well, we have, believe it or not, a system in this world of seed banks. In our country, we have about 35 of them. They are all part of something called the National Plant Germplasm System. You ever want to take a trip that's fascinating, go to Geneva, New York. It's not far. That's the apple seed bank. They have thousands of varieties of apples there. Why do they have them? Because most of them have been driven out of the marketplace by the need for large, efficient farms and orchards. So the seed banks preserve the last members of the group that's being discarded. And why do they preserve them? Because if you have a disease, you need to, the scientists will come and will say, oh, there's a terrible blight on wheat. Actually, there is a terrible blight on wheat now, I'll tell you that. And we need genes for resistance to this blight. Where are we going to get them? Well, we're going to plant 52 different kinds of wheat. We're going to see which kind doesn't get the disease. We're going to grab the genetic material, the DNA, from that plant, and we are going to get it to extract it, to breed into other kinds of wheat so that the wheat will be resistant to the new wheat will be resistant to the disease. It's a simple thing. We do it all the time in human beings. We do, but it's very, very important in agriculture because it preserves the health of the crop. In our country now, we have 35 of these seed banks. There's a place, did anybody ever hear this, called the Doomsday Vault? Heard about the Doomsday Vault? Norway, has a part of Norway which is very close to the Arctic Circle. Anybody ever read Hans Christian Andersen, The Snow Queen? That's where the Snow Queen lives. It's so far north that it's almost in the Arctic, and it's still part north. And the world's nations have dug into this part of the world a huge vault under 400 feet of permafrost and rock. It is freezing, freezing cold. There's nothing there but polar bears, as will be. And into that vault, every country in the world has deposited the major seeds of its indigenous agriculture. The reason it's called the Doomsday Vault is because it's supposed to be in case we manage to blow ourselves up, or we poison the planet, or there's such terrible global warming that we can't have agriculture the way it used to be anymore, that we in this frozen vault called the Doomsday Vault, it's actually in a place called Svalbard, the Svalbard Global Seed Depository. We will have the original seeds in case we have to start agriculture all over again. Imagine how serious things are if the scientific authorities in 160 countries have decided that they need to deposit the basic seed germplasm of every country's agriculture in this vault under the ground. They know something we don't know, right? They know that climate change and global warming are very, very dangerous, that in 100 years or 150 years, things could change so dramatically in the agriculture, in the climate of agriculture, that we'll have to go into this vault and pull out these old seeds and renew our agriculture with this stuff. Now, what are the conclusions? This book, The Viking Louis Field, is about a man who was the greatest seed banker in the world. I'm going to read you one paragraph that a fellow from the University of Massachusetts, the fellow named Garrison Wilkes, and he described what gene banking was. He's a wonderful man. He teaches at the University of Massachusetts. Garrison Wilkes said, "The utility of the gene bank is so long-range, so subtle, that it doesn't devolve to the credit of one person. It doesn't give you a discovery. It doesn't give you a breakthrough. It's an abiding support system that requires constant tending, a very long view of agriculture as a historic, ongoing endeavor, and a monumental sense of responsibility to generations past and future." That's what the seed banker does. The seed banker doesn't discover the cure for anything. The seed banker doesn't announce that he's got a new plant that's going to revolutionize the gasoline industry. He doesn't discover nutraceuticals and present you with new drugs. He sits in his vault and he sorts out the seeds and he saves them in aluminum and hermetically sealed aluminum envelopes. He wears an LL Bean padded coat because it's so cold in there. And he's got little workers who are separating seeds on white light tables. It is a phenomenal effort of preservation, sorting information. If you want to plant a garden now, you can send an email to something called GRIN at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and you can say to them, "I want to grow mangoes in Winchester, Massachusetts. Is there any breed of mango that could possibly grow in my garden?" And they will send you back all the information that you could possibly need about growing mangoes in Winchester, which you probably can't do. They'll probably can't do anything else and move south. But the point is that there is now on the web, because of people like Ben Skovma who was the hero of the Viking movie, an enormous amount of information available to the public, which brings me to one final point. And there are lots of things we could talk about, and I want us to talk. And that is about what the public owns in terms of agriculture. In 1980, there was a terrible oil spill. It was even bigger than the Exxon Valdez. It was in the Gulf of Mexico. It was even worse than the BP Horizon. It was a nightmare, and they didn't know what to do. And it's pumping millions of gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And there was a guy at General Electric, a guy named Chakrabarty, who had invented a bacterium which, like Miss Pac-Man, could eat oil. It was a bacterium. At least he said it could eat oil. And they were trying to patent it. And they'd been trying to patent it for years. But the courts kept saying, you can't patent life. What are you talking about? It's a form of life. You can't patent life. Life belongs to everybody. But then there was this terrible, terrible oil spill. And the Supreme Court in the United States said, you know what? Let's give this guy a patent on this bacteria. And that was the beginning of the ability, legal ability in our country to patent forms of life. Not just, a pretty new rose. That was really an aesthetic invention and that lasted for 20 years. This was the invention of a new bacteria, a new microbe, by combining what we were learning about genetics, combining DNA from one creature and combining it with another creature and making a new creature, a new form of life. The Supreme Court, by unleashing this law in the United States, also unleashed a huge increase in the amount of investment that major corporations made in the creation of new forms of life, some of which were plants. What has happened in the 30 years since then is that we have now got a number of corporations which we call great international life science corporations. Syngenta, Bayerische Anleihen-und-Soda-Fabrik, BASF, Swiss, German, Monsanto. These are basically people who used to be in the chemical business, who got into the business of adding substances to seeds that would change the plant that came up, and then they would patent it. I will give you an example. Everybody here, I think, probably has maybe a driveway, and you've ever had a weed in your driveway. You can spritz it with something called Roundup. A wonderful thing that Monsanto makes, which you spritz weed, it collapses now. And if you're doing it, it's great. This is what Monsanto did. They created an herbicide called Roundup, which was very good for killing weeds in fields. The trouble with this thing that you would put on the field is that it killed the weed, and say it was growing tomatoes. It would kill the tomatoes too, or the alfalfa, or the cotton killed. So Monsanto then develops a kind of seed which is impervious to Roundup, right? Now, in order to kill your weeds, you can spray Roundup to kill your weeds, but you gotta buy the seed for your crop that is impervious to the Roundup. I'm talking double dipping here, but it has really been a bonanza. And it hasn't just been a bonanza for Monsanto, it's been a bonanza for Brazil. Brazil has become a world power, really, very much because of the huge increase in income from Roundup Ready soybeans. they're ready to tear down the rainforest to plant more because there's a limitless market. So when a great corporation makes money, they don't just make money for their shareholders, they make money for other people too. Other people who use the product. Now, this has all companies, you can multiply this many, many times by many, many corporations, all of which seem to have been chemical companies, actually poison companies at one time or another, but there's a thin line between poison and cure, as we all know in medicine. Like it can kill you, it can also kill you. Ben Skovman used to say that if we weren't careful, four companies were going to eventually control the seed supply of the entire world, and that has just about happened. That has just about happened. So when you go and you buy your organic seeds, remember that you are doing great favor for the planet because you are preserving diversity, you are fighting hugeness and monoculture in agriculture, and you're standing up for the little guy, the commons, the seed banks, should they ever fall into the hands of private companies, would be a huge loss to the commons. We are the commons. Things that are owned by the people. Things that the air and the water and the forest, the national parks. Should they be owned by the people or should they be owned by Weyerhaeuser lumber? You have to make these decisions now because little by little, depending on who's in power in politics, the ownership of what used to belong to all humanity falls into the purview and the ownership becomes part of some corporation's assets. And it is a great loss to the people. Skovman spent his whole life preserving the seeds of the world and then keeping them by whatever means in the commons. Nobody ever got hold of the seed bank that he built in Mexico. He built a great seed bank in Mexico, corn and wheat. And they kept it, he and the people who associated with him, kept it as belonging to the commons. And every year, somebody offers the research institution where these seed banks are huge amounts of money. Huger and huger and huger for the germplasm that lies therein. And the same thing is true for doomsday. Somebody's always out there going, I could give you a couple million for the doomsday bowl. I'll take it over. And I'll share. This is the basic problem that we're in now. And the way that problem is solved is going to control what happens to the food supply for our grandchildren. So that's what I have to say. And any questions or discussion, I would love to. Yes.
I've read that if a farmer wants to save his seeds and Monsanto is involved somehow with the genetically modified seeds, that they can sue the farmer for using his saved seeds. How does that work?
Oh, it's been awful. I mean, there was a farmer in Canada. This is what happened. A farmer in Canada who's growing his own, you grow your own crop and you save a little for the plants and you save them for seed. And then the next year you plant them. That's how farmers have done it since time immemorial. Over the years, private companies have developed, and this was Henry Wallace too, have developed kinds of seeds that are so superior that it's worth it to the farmer to pay money to the company for the seed and not save some. This farmer in Canada, his name was Percy Schneiser, I think. He had a field here and of regular seed, and then there was a field of genetically modified seed that was Roundup Ready in the next. And some of the seed from this field blew into his field and mated with his, I mean, it's photosynthesis, folks. It's, the breezes blow the seeds, and the birds carry it. And Monsanto said that he was growing their patented plants without paying them. How did they find out? They sent the lawyers. When I talked to, when I was working on this book, and I was in Dr. Skogman's study in Sweden, and I'm reading all his papers, and he got a letter from somebody who said, I'm going crazy from these Monsanto guys. They got law degrees and they got degrees in microbiology. You can't fight them. They know everything. They're geniuses. They know everything. So they sued this guy for using their plants without paying them. He said, I didn't do anything. All I did was farm my own field, and the breeze, the winds over Canada blew your seed into mine. I didn't steal anything from you guys. It just happened. And the judges voted against him. The company sued him and ruined him. That got so much terrible publicity. In response, the people on the other side don't just lie down and take it. Some of us find that. There was a guy who, remember the Terminator movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, where he's the monstrous Terminator and he's like a cyborg and he comes and kills everybody. That was a movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger in which he plays a horrifying robot. And Monsanto had developed a kind of seed that, in order to spare themselves this business with the lawyers and checking on everybody, they developed a kind of seed that you could plant once, it would grow its crop, but the seed that it produced was barren. It would never reproduce. So you couldn't save it. You couldn't save it because it was useless. You couldn't plant it again. You had to buy it again. Well, this guy, this fellow, also a Canadian, said, you know what this is called? Terminator technology. This is what it is. It's like unleashing a monstrous robot into the field and killing off the next generation of seed so that you're powerless against the company. And there was so much bad publicity that Monsanto actually, for the time being, and in a good time, discontinued the production of this particular kind of seed. If once we are distracted by something else and we're not looking, it'll come back. You know it'll come back. Because those 3% of the farmers who are making 75% of the food are making a lot of money from this. They are making a lot of money from this. The little farmer is, going all along like my great-grandfathers. He's just doing his thing. But the big farmers, the industrial farmers with the giant machines, they're working with these corporations, and they're all doing well. And that includes the Brazilians, includes the French, includes the Swiss. We're talking about lots of people. So the problem is, if you fight back too much, you are hurting somebody else. You're hurting some group of your fellow Americans is losing their jobs. Some group of your fellow Americans is going to be hurt. So this is a complicated thing. To ask people to do something that's good for the country, that's bad for them. It's always a complicated thing. Anybody else? Yes?
Is there a relation between the modified seed and food that they're producing today and the increased number of people who have cancer? I read that there was a relation.
I have not. I've been looking for it. They're looking for it, and they really haven't found it. They really
I'm
haven't.
just reading a book. There's a holistic doctor that wrote that.
Yeah.
You don't have an opinion on that?
I have not heard that is true. I have heard, some people say it, but the scientific community in general,
They don't want to admit it.
I don't know whether they don't want to admit it, they don't believe it. They don't believe it.
Well, there is an increased number of people with cancer.
but I don't know whether it's from genetically modified food. It might be from all the.
What else do you think it could be from?
Well, it might be from all the, now that we know how much radiation is actually flying around the world. I mean, maybe it's that, maybe, it could be of many things. You're absolutely right about the increase, it could be many things. And maybe they will prove that, I think that, for example, the increase in, a lot of people think this, that the increase in celiac disease and wheat allergy, which we never had when we were, I don't remember it when I was a girl, when the people would say, well, I'm allergic to bread, I can't eat bread that has wheat in it. Now so many people do. And that may indeed be, have something to do with pesticides or herbicides. So far there's no genetically modified wheat. And the reason is twofold. The information about wheat, which Dr. Skogman put on the web, so that it would be free for everybody, is out there for everybody to use. And also, wheat is hard to modify genetically. You've got to really do an awful lot of genetic manipulation. That's very expensive land. To make cotton is easier, soybeans are easier. Anybody else? Yes?
Well, you haven't mentioned some of the drawbacks or the problems with, for instance, these genetically modified seeds. The crop seed is resistant to Roundup, but pretty soon it'll spread, the seeds will spread and it will hybridize with some other plant, maybe not some,
Like
not
Percy's
even
mice,
tomatoes,
right?
but with other plants and weeds, and the weeds won't be killed by Roundup.
You're absolutely right. That's
Can you
that's
repeat
beginning to happen.
Can you repeat what she said?
Yes,
please?
what she's saying is that there is a set of bad effects that happen when you spray constantly with Roundup and you use these Roundup-ready seeds. And it's not, I must keep pointing out, it's not just Monsanto. There are 4 or 5 other huge companies that have all kinds of modified seed out there. And that what she's saying is that eventually the weeds that you're supposed to kill develop a resistance to the very chemical that you've been spraying on everything else. And that has already begun to happen. There are weeds that are now resistant to glyphosate. Yes, of course. And you know what happens? Then the corporations send their brilliant people, many of whom live in our area, who are scientists who lived in Massachusetts and work for great corporations like this, and they're going to figure out another, keep figuring out another way to try and stay 1 step or 2 steps ahead of evolution. Not so easy. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to build on that point because in the looking only at what's happening in the field and not looking at what's happening in the adjacent fields, when that scenario takes place in India or takes place in Africa, the point I wanted to make so that you could comment on it and other people could too was that when that was applied in what was called the Green Revolution, because it killed all the weeds around the edges of the field, and because those weeds were how people supplemented their diet in those countries, this miraculous Green Revolution, in fact, probably contributed to diets getting worse. And people's belief that the Green Revolution was such a miracle is now enabling scientists and huge foundations to foist a new Green Revolution that part of the world thinks is another blessing in Africa. So whatever disaster this is for countries like this, the disaster that it probably begins to create in developing countries is whole scales of more dangerous. And I wish we could talk about that too.
We could talk about that, and there's a lot of controversy about that. And the controversy, what she's saying is, did everybody hear? The Norman Borlaug Anybody know who he was? He just died recently. A very great plant breeder who was the man behind what they call the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was a scientific consortium of which Ben Scoville was part, because he was a student of Borlaug's, to develop kinds of seed that people could use in India, in Sri Lanka, in Turkey, and in Pakistan, where there were periodic terrible famines. Seed that would be more durable for people, and would grow in greater quantity and with greater frequency. Maybe you could get 2 or 3 harvests in a year, and would be more impervious to the nightmares of weather. Though the Green Revolution was based on the discovery after the Second World War by a guy from the United States Department of Agriculture who was involved in the occupation of Japan, of a very short, stumpy kind of wheat that the Japanese had. And Borlaug looked at that short, stumpy kind of wheat, and he said, when a terrible typhoon blows or a terrible storm comes, the tall, spindly wheat falls over, breaks, and collapses. The short, stumpy wheat from Japan stays in the ground. So with every good intention, these people I cannot ever underestimate the good intentions of people who are plant scientists. They're trying to save the world. They put the genes from this short, stumpy wheat together with the wheat that Borlaug had raised in Mexico, and they got an intermediate, kind of what they used to call a semi-dwarf wheat. It's a little bit bigger, but it wasn't as big. And they grew it in Mexico. They developed it in labs and in fields in Mexico with great effort, and people really broke their necks over this in the broiling sun. And they sent tons of seed to these countries, which were then distributed, and farmers had food, reliable food, for the first time in history. And it was called the Green Revolution, because since the Green Revolution, the kind of famine that plagued India every 5 years has not happened. Since the Green Revolution, Turkey's GNP has skyrocketed because of the growth of the agricultural sector. Now, this had nothing to do with Monsanto. This had nothing to do with BASF. This is not a matter of chemistry. This is a matter of breeding, of a guy standing in a lab, taking the female part of the plant and the male part of the plant and going bang, 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 and and they're putting a bag over it and letting it breed into a new wheat, which was semi-dwarf and impervious to various kinds of weather and would grow in these starting countries. That Green Revolution did have some very bad fallout. But it wasn't so much the weeds, I think, at the edge of the field, which is as the political and economic arrangements that had been made since then, like the North American Free Trade Agreement, and things which have affected farmers' ability to sell to their neighbors and to buy their own product. What happens is that a guy in India can get good price for his wheat if he sells it to Russia or China. But if he sells it in his own country, he can't. He gets a very bad price. And this has to do with price supports. It has to do with economic regulations. It has to do with tariffs, things that this farmer can't even begin to control. And that's like the guy walking down the road saying, you've got 973 sheep. That's who's running this show. The guy who's got the dog under his arm and doesn't know the show. That's who's running the show. And insofar as the farmer can figure out what that guy is doing And insofar as that guy can figure out what humanity really needs, not the bottom line, but what our grandchildren really need, insofar as his heart opens and the farmer's mind opens, then we will have a solution. Some kind of solution, we must have one, to this terrible problem of oncoming hunger. I just want to add one thing that nobody ever talks about. Everybody says 9 billion people are going to be here by 2050. Where is that written? Why is that engraved in stone? There shouldn't be 9 billion people on the planet. There shouldn't be 9 billion people on the planet. Can't. And then there's going to be a 10, and there's going to be 11. And it's not, and the scientists will figure out how to feed everybody. You know, they'll make some kind of microbial stew in the kitchen. And we'll all eat something that purports to be food that is made of something else. You know. But if you to blind yourself to the idea of population control, family planning, and to say this is not part of the problem is crazy. It is part of the problem. It is part of the problem, particularly in countries where there is endemic poverty and there is endemic starvation. So that, I just want to throw that out there. Anybody else? Thank you. Oh, yes.
No, so Dr. Skull's mom has passed away.
Yes.
Has someone, you said he was the world's greatest seed banker.
He trained everybody. He trained
who was
all the
taken-
people who were
yeah,
working
who's
at the
taken
Doomsday
over?
Vault. Yes. There are all these people that Garrison Wilkes described who sit in these wonderful places, orchards, seed banks. Some of them are in vaults, some of them are in Norway. I urge you to go visit one. I mean, the Geneva one is so much fun. It's beautiful, and they'll take you on a tour. And it's a fun day trip, and it's not full back. And it's so, once you've seen one, you get it. You get it. And Skovman trained most of the leaders of the seed banks around the world. He helped them set up the seed bank. He trained their workers. The people he trained early workers. And they are, if you read the papers, and you see that the budget of the Department of Agriculture is being cut, and they're cutting the National Plant germplasm system. That's something we can't afford to cut. It takes very little money to run these places. This is a little thing compared to what the wheat growers get and what the corn growers get. This is a little thing, but it preserves the diversity that saves the world, and it has to be really preserved. In fact, I believe that most communities, and we're doing this, I live in the Berkshires, and there's a botanical garden there, and they're beginning to have a little local seed bank. It's, you know, what happens when there's a disaster, like, and what happens when there's a nature? Everything is wiped out. Agriculture, look that way that tsunami rolled across those fields. You've got to have seed. And you've got to have a diversity of seed to replace that agriculture. That terrible wave, we saw pictures of it, just gobbled up the rice. It gobbled up the wheat. It gobbled up the veggies. Somebody's got to replant. You can't replant without seed. The seed has to belong to the people, to the commons. Yes.
I'm from southwestern Ohio, and every time I go back to visit, I see more and more farmland turned into developments. So you might have the seeds, but where's the farmland that they're going to grow the crops on? It's discouraging.
It's it's the small farmer who's selling. Either he or she is selling to developers or they're selling to big farmers. I met a guy when I was working on this book, who lives in Kansas. He has been buying out his neighbors, 200 acres by 200 acres by 200 acres. He and his brothers. They've now got 4,000 acres of alfalfa and corn and wheat and sorghum that they are very attentive to diversity, these particular people. That's a huge farm. And he's gonna get bigger. And he's got machines that are half the size of this room that you come across the fields. It's like being in a hotel room. You get into one of these huge monster combines, and you see how they run by computer. You know, you don't really have to get out, and nobody touches the ground anymore. The farmer walks through and puts it in. But that machine takes care of a lot of jobs.
During World War II, we had to ration food. Maybe we'll have to ration food again.
Yes, that would be very, very sad.
Her coupons, she could only get so much meat and so much sugar.
And did everybody have a victory garden too? My
Yes.
mom,
My father did.
yeah, had a victory garden. I was a little girl, she had a victory garden. And we grew a lot of veggies. We grew a lot of stuff in this victory garden, and it came right into the kitchen. You know, there's an interesting thing too about bigness. During Stalin, in the Soviet Union, during the time of Stalin, they decided to collectivize agriculture. And they made huge farms, and they took all the farmers out of their little houses and out of their little fields, and made them to be members of this collective, this vast collective. Everybody farmed, the state. And in short order, the Russians were starving to death. There was not enough food. There was just not enough food. And they lost millions of people. We're talking about a country which is the breadbasket of the world. We think of Kansas as the breadbasket of the world, but actually Ukraine is, if they could ever get over all the radioactivity there. So the Russians couldn't feed their own people. And there was then the wars coming, and there were more problems, and it's not so easy to get it from any place else. And Stalin had to make a new rule that everybody could have one cow, one pig, one little plot for vegetables. Everybody could have that. And suddenly the country was eaten again. Bigness is, it seems to me, from what I have seen, is inimical to eating. Whether it's bigness by capitalists, where 3% of the farms produce 75% of the food, and if something happens to those 3%, if an Irish potato famine comes, we're, finished. Whether it's socialist bigness, when you have little collectives, they work. When you have little farms, and when I say little, 400-acre farmers, security is agriculture. Because agriculture is out there. It's right out there. Remember the Iranians and the Iraqis had a war in Saddam Hussein's about 74. The Iranians had these pistachio nut orchards. They actually had a corner on the world market for pistachios. If you bought a bag of pistachios, it was generally from Iran. This is in the 60s, before the Revolutionary Guard took over. And when the Iraqis bombed Iran, the first thing they did was they bombed all the pistachio orchards, destroyed and ruined the Iranian pistachio crops, because the bombing, what it destroys the earth, it doesn't just destroy the trees, it destroys the soil. If you ask the guy in California today, he says the best thing that ever happened to him, because now you buy a bag of pistachios, it's all from California. They leaped into the market. One man's catastrophe is another man's good living. Thank you very much.